MacCoy's condo complex has crumbling foundations. She's been pushing for testing for years and says this is a necessity.
Hello, I'm Debbie MacCoy, Connecticut Concrete, and to recap 2025, I did a three-part series on the two aggregate schemes relating to the crisis affecting homeowners across the Republic of Ireland and the disparities between investigations, schemes, solutions, and treatment by the biases of cost to make the victims whole. The first was the Pyrite heave crisis beginning in 2003, 2 years after Ireland allowed self-regulation. By 2005, cracks started appearing just 2 years after construction. It was first thought to be settling cracks or poor workmanship, and engineers were chasing the cracks. It was in 2007 when Pyrite heave was confirmed cause of cracking, which wasn't due to improper workmanship, but rather improper sourcing for aggregate for hardcore fill. Please see the EU Harmonized European Norm HEN 13242, 2002, SR 21, 2004, and IS 398, 2013, Part 1, IS 398, 2017, Part 1, and IS 398, 2013, Part 2. Registrants and Technical Committees members, number 58. The cause, rhomboidal pyrite in the aggregate used for hardcore fill. From confirmed awareness in 2007 to public awareness in August of 2011 to remediation scheme in 2013 to 3,000 homes repaired up to 2025, costing hundreds of millions of euro. The second was the defective concrete block crisis beginning in the same time period of the Pyrite heave. It was thought to be settling cracks, or poor workmanship, or some other kind of mechanical failure such as freeze-thaw or weak blocks. However, rather than improper workmanship, it became clear when county after county was experiencing the same pattern cracking, map cracking on the exterior blocks. It was due to improper sourcing for aggregate for use in concrete. Please see the EU Harmonized European Norm HEN 12620, 2002, SR, and SR stands for Standard Recommendation, SR 16, 2004, and IS 465, 2018 registrants and Technical Committee number 63 members. The cause, rhomboidal pyrite in the aggregate used to make concrete in the majority of affected counties, and I'm going to put mica in parentheses, pyrite in the aggregate used to make concrete in County Donegal. When reviewing each IS 465 registered engineer, I learned from reading from Karen Gallagher's of Advanced Survey Solution, IS 465 Professional Summary, that he first investigated house cracking in April 2011. He states in the summary, I have been involved in the inspection of several of the first reported incidents of house cracking in Donegal, and I believe that I was the first engineer to identify that the most likely cause of the extensive cracking being experienced was as a result of high levels of muscovite mica being present in both the fine and coarse aggregates used in the manufacture of blocks used in the construction of affected homes. So this segment, this part 2, is on the engineers that were involved in both schemes, the Pyrite Remediation Scheme and the Defective Concrete Block Grant Scheme. I was first instructed to investigate the initial cases of house cracking in April 2011 and quickly found that the distinctive crack pattern, which was typical in all the properties, did not resemble any of the crack patterns of any of the common causes of cracking. I was able to eliminate all of these as being the root cause of the problem. This is Karen Gallagher who's speaking in his professional summary on the IS 465 registrants summaries. Then, through analyzing any of the similarities between the methods of construction, materials used, and tradesmen involved in the construction of each individual house, I was able to reduce any similarities just to one common factor, and as a result, narrow my opinion of the cause of this issue to the concrete blocks used to construct each house. I extracted several block samples from several individual houses and instructed Barry Rankin and Mark Russell from the testing laboratory within the construction division of the School of Planning, Architecture, and Civil Engineering in Queen's University, Belfast, to investigate any abnormalities within the composition of these samples. Through petrographic analysis of the composition of the block samples, we were able to determine that the likely cause of extensive cracking being experienced in all of the houses investigated was the high levels of muscovite mica present in both the fine and coarse aggregate within the blocks. And I'm still on Karen Gallagher's professional summary. I have carried out extensive research and have thoroughly inspected well in excess of 50 dwellings with visible cracks and believe that I have become very experienced in identifying cracks that may be as a result of high levels of muscovite mica being present in the blocks used in the construction of that dwelling. This summary was created 12/31/2018. Now, I've heard some manufacturers say, and I'll read what I wrote, the manufacturers of concrete blocks who say they followed the standard for making concrete blocks. Maybe. But did they test the aggregate prior to using it in the concrete mix? That is a very important question to be asked and answered. The slump tests aren't going to tell you if you have reactive iron sulfur mineral present in the aggregate just used to create the concrete blocks. Aggregate not tested is aggregate at risk. Quarry producers need to prove their quality of aggregate by testing it for iron sulfide minerals. In 2026, the three-part series on Ireland's crisis is regarding the stakeholders involved with both aggregate schemes. The first remediation scheme involved immense testing and research from experts in geology and engineering. The second grant scheme involved some testing and literature reviews with a remit to the expert panel, no testing to be commissioned, and a 2017 expert panel report stating it was suggested the cause was mica in County Donegal and pyrite in County Mayo. My first of the three-part series that aired in January 2026 was regarding the stakeholders from the Department of Housing and the Housing Agency, as well as the Pyrite Resolution Board, and the 2022 expert group constituted by Housing Minister Dara O'Brien. I spoke about DOH Minister Phil Hogan, who headed the Pyrite Solutions. Damon English, who, as you remember, in 2018 was elated that 1,000 homes were repaired because, remember, he was on the council for County Meath, and so that's important to remember. County Meath and and Fingal were both the hardest hit counties or areas. And Darren O'Brien, and have referenced the Attorney General's letter, but wasn't able to read the letter in that segment. But I will read it. I am going to get to that. But that's 6 pages long. That's almost an entire show. I spoke of the Housing Agency, Pyrite Resolution members John O'Connor and Martin Lynch, and John Wickham from the Department of Housing. Today, I would like to speak to you about the engineers involved in the two aggregate schemes. First, I want to preface this with an understanding that I believe the structural engineers who came up with the Pyrite Resolution and Remediation Scheme are some of the smartest and brightest engineers who use their expertise and geologist analysis to eradicate a crisis with speed and responsibility, and always remembering the cause was not of the homeowner's doing. However, as of late, I am perplexed by some of these bright engineers who work hard to get the course of testing and method of remediation right the first time for the victims of tainted aggregate used in hardcore fill. And yet, the victims of tainted aggregate used in concrete to make concrete blocks haven't had the same reaction of getting it right the first time. What is the common denominator that caused both crises across Ireland? Tainted aggregate that was improperly sourced. EU regulations that were improperly enforced. A remit that would improperly investigate the actual cause, and a reluctance to understanding aggregate is the original sin. In a letter written to Lisa Holm from Donegal County Council, they referred to the grant scheme, the DCB Defective Concrete Block Grant Scheme, as the engineer-led scheme. And they're correct in their reference, as the Technical Committee number 63 for IS 465 is top-heavy with engineers. When I look at the registrar for IS 398, there are 17 engineers. The registrar for IS 465, there was 31 engineers for the past few years, and now there are 39. Of the 8 engineers added, 4 of them are from DBFL, Consulting Engineering. What is interesting is that there are 7 DBFL engineers between IS 398 registrar and IS 465, and some of the 7 are on both registrars as well as on the IS 465 Technical Committee. And DBFL is one of the engineer consulting firms who was tendered and indemnified by the housing agency for the Enhanced Defective Concrete Block Scheme. The founder of DBFL, Mr. Paul Ford, was the chairperson for IS 398 Part 2, 2013, Technical Committee number 58. He was also on the informal Pyrite Resolution Board from 2012 to 2013. As one of the engineers who drafted the remediation method, his company, DBFL Consulting Engineers, was one of the firms for the pyrite heave repairs before and after the scheme was implemented. He was also the chair of the expert group constituted in January 2022, reconstituted in 2023, and in February 2025, Minister O'Brien forwarded his research on the cause of cracking houses in Donegal that he had received in November 2024 to Mr. Paul Ford. The minister wanted the expert group to advise him on what these research implications would mean for the enhanced scheme. As well, Mr. Ford was mentioned in the September 7th, 2021 letter from the Attorney General to the Housing Minister awaiting Mr. Ford's report, which, as I previously mentioned, confuses me because Mr. Ford in his Dahl testimony in June 22 stated he was asked to chair an expert group in January 2022. So I don't know what the Attorney General was waiting for in September 2021 when he wasn't asked to be a part of the expert group and chair it until January 2022. Mr. Ford in March 2022 met with 2 coalition advocates, one from Mayo and one from Donegal, regarding their asks to better facilitate a working remediation scheme. However, the remit for the expert group was one that had limits to what the group was to discuss, which were mere window dressings than actually tackling the 3 major barriers to the scheme. To remind you of those 3 barriers: upfront costs and shortfall costs, damage threshold, and the standard being the Irish standard IS 465 being misdiagnosed. Mr. Paul Ford, since 2006, has played a significant role in Ireland's iron sulfide mineral crisis, first investigating the cause for floor heaving in the Dublin area. As mentioned, it was first believed to be improper workmanship or a mechanical failure. However, not long after the experts in the field of geology, geotechnical engineering, and petrography in the summer of 2007 did folks understand the actual cause was due to framboidal pyrite and the aggregate used as hardcore fill. His firm was involved in multiple repair work for the homes that were at that time still being covered by Homebound. Once Homebound informed Minister Hogan in August 2011 that they would no longer cover the cost of repairs, he quickly moved to set up a pyrite panel to investigate the magnitude and impact. The cause of the floor heaving was clear. It was due to the reactive iron sulfide mineral in the aggregate used. The pyrite panel met with 44 individual firms' experts, and from the suggestions in the report, the minister set up in 2012 an informal pyrite resolution board to draft the testing method and repair method and set up a pyrite remediation scheme. Paul Ford was one of the members on the informal PRB, and in 2013, when the Pyrite Remediation Scheme was created, his firm became one of the tendered consulting engineers and engineering firms to repair affected homes. The PRB and housing agency worked well together, one overseeing the scheme and the other implementing the scheme and respecting each other's roles in making this first-of-a-kind scheme successful. In April 2012, Paul Ford was part of the Pyrite Symposium along with Dr. Brian Hawkins, Dr. Thomas St. John, Trinity's Robbie Goodhue. His presentation at the symposium, The Effect of Heave on Structures. There's also a chapter written by Ford in Brian Hawkins' books, Implications of Pyrite Oxidation for Engineering Works, which is right there, A Structural Engineer's Perspective. When I spoke with Dr. Thomas St. John, he mentioned the book was based on the 2 years of research he and Dr. Hawkins did during 2011 and 2012. And the chapters in the book reflect their time in Ireland, with folks like James Lombard, who discussed sampling, Mike Eaton, who discussed testing, and Ford discussing engineering. Hawkins discussed the 3 forms of pyrite, and I explained this in a previous segment. Pyrite in cube form, least reactive, framboidal pyrite, very reactive, and peritite, the most reactive of the 3. At the Pyrite Symposium, Hawkins talked about Ireland having both pyrite and peritite in the stone being used in Ireland. In 2014, Paul Ford and Dr. Brian Hawkins addressed the CIF, Construction Ireland Federation, in a briefing in August 2014. In 2019, a reporter from the Hartford Courant in the USA came to Ireland as she was doing a 3-part series on Canada, Ireland, and USA, and what Connecticut could learn from Ireland's crisis. Prior to Carolyn Lumsden going to Ireland, I gave her my file folder on Ireland that had the research I had acquired up to 2019. It was one folder. Today, I have 20 to 30 folders. I looked intently at the Pyrite Remediation Scheme in 2018 because I had hoped we could use their template for our remediation scheme that soon would be implemented in January 2019. I particularly was interested in the project manager position and creating a snag list, and that the project manager role was one of interest to all involved in a home repair, and if there was an issue, the homeowner could give the project manager a snag list of issues to be fixed. During her February trip to Ireland, Carolyn met with Martin Lynch and conducted an interview with Paul Ford of DBFL and James Lombard of Ground Investigations Ireland. Upon her return, she did an article on how Ireland protects homeowners with cracking concrete and what we can learn from Ireland. In the 2019 article on Ireland, Mr. Ford was quoted as saying, "You could impose such strict limits to ensure that nothing ever happens, but you might find you've not got any stone that'll achieve those limits." Think about that for a second. She also quoted James Lombard. "I've just seen so many people affected, and that's wrong. It should never be allowed to happen again." James Lombard was on both the technical committees 58 for IS 398 and number 63 for IS 465 until his death. Therefore, he wasn't a part of the IS 465 review that's ongoing. And it's been ongoing since the minister said there's going to be a review in November 2021. We are now in January 2026, and it's still not done. In March 2019, after Carolyn Lumpson's trip, she put me in touch with Martin Lynch, as well as Ann Owens and Eileen Doherty from the MICA Action Group. I knew little about the MICA crisis in early 2019. I had heard about the defective concrete blocks in Mayo and Donegal, but didn't have much research on the DCB crisis. However, upon emailing Martin Lynch and inviting him to the USA International Conference I was holding in October 2019, my verbose email may have caused concern as I wrote in detail about the pyrite crisis in Connecticut's foundations in the USA. Martin Lynch would not be attending the international conference. However, in March 2019, I was put in touch with Ann Owens and Eileen Doherty of the MAG Coalition and invited them to the international conference and offered to cover their costs, which was accepted. Mr. Paul Ford of DBFL has been one of the most used experts in the iron sulfide mineral crisis and most worked because of his experience, expertise, and connections to everyone. Connections to another bright engineer, Aidan O'Connell of AOCO. In fact, one of his employed engineers, Colin Scott, used to work at DBFL prior to working for AOCO. Colin Scott is on the technical committees 58 and 63. He's a registrant on IS 398 and IS 465 and a design professional for the IS 398. Mr. Ford has worked with Dr. Michael Mayer, who also was in Hawkins' book and later was the editor of Pyrite and Pyrite, and who also attended the Pyrite Symposium. As I mentioned, he has worked with Ground Investigations Ireland, James Lombard, worked with Robbie Goodow of Fastnet and Trinity College Dublin, worked with John O'Connor, chairman of the PRB, Martin Lynch, general manager of the PRB, Damon Owens, director general of Engineers Ireland, Mike Eaton of Sandburg, Sean Balfe of NSAI, and DOH officials and ministers. Mr. Ford, along with his 6 engineers, have been on both the technical committees and the registrars for IS 398 and IS 465. Martin Bennett is one of his senior structural engineers who stated in his professional summary that he's inspected 1,500 properties affected. He was on the technical committee number 58, the IS 398 registrant, and one of the added IS 465 registrants, and is an IS 398 design professional. And I'm quoting his summary. "I have inspected over 1,500 properties affected by pyrite since the issue first arose in the Leinster area in 2006. Various claims by private clients against Premier Guarantee 2009 to ongoing. Carrying out building condition assessments and reporting in the standard Premier template for 20 private clients." Another structural engineer. I'm speaking of the 6 that along with Paul Ford, were involved in either one or the other or both. Michael Conley, senior structural engineer, who stated in his professional summary, carried out in excess of 100 visual inspections and coordinated up to 15 engineers to carry out visual inspections of 700 properties affected with Pyrite stone infill. Wrote reports for in excess of 500 of these properties based on the visual inspection findings and test results on stone infill. Inspected and certified remedial works for in excess of 50 of these properties, gathering evidence for lawsuits against stone suppliers during the works. He was an IS 398 registrant, IS 398 design professional, and one of the added IS 465 registrants. Remember, I said there was, for a long period of time, only 31 registrants on IS 465, but then when I just looked at the list a week ago, I noticed there was an additional 8 more engineers on IS 465 register. And out of the new 8, 4 of them came from DBFL. So again, Martin Bennett was one of the added, Michael Connolly was one of the added, Adian Burke, associate with DBFL Consulting Engineers, is a registrant on IS 398 and an IS 398 design professional. In 2010, he was awarded the Association of Consulting Engineer of Ireland, ACEI, President's Award for Excellence in Design. So the registrants that were on the list, they could go out, inspect, write up a building condition assessment, and they could also do the repairs of these homes. Liam Brehan was an associate director with DBFL, is an IS 398 registrant, and an IS 398 design professional. He's a chartered engineer with responsibilities from commencement to completion of projects. His relevant project experience include housing at Glen Abaheen, Enfield, County Meath, 2008 to 2011, carried out condition inspections on 95 houses showing suspected Pyrite heave damage, and carried out inspections and certification for pyrite remediation works to 40 of these houses. So this kind of baffles me because the Pyrite Remediation Scheme was based on 9 local authorities in the Dublin area, and yet Liam is looking into County Meath for Pyrite heave, and I didn't realize that until I was just doing my research on each of the engineers. Colm Doyle, director. Colm has over 15 years experience in investigation and remediation of pyrite-related defects in numerous buildings and developments across the residential, retail, and commercial sectors. Colm also has experience in the forensic investigation and identification of defects within buildings not associated with pyrite heave, including substandard and defective blockwork, one of the added IS 465 registrants. Now, I want to say something about that. They talk about looking into the Pyrite infill. They look into substandard defective blockwork, but they never say aggregate, ever. It's all about, the Pyrite stone or the substandard defective blockwork, but that Pyrite heave was caused by aggregate that had reactive framboidal pyrite. The defective concrete blocks aren't substandard because the block maker mold of the blocks wasn't proper. It was the aggregate that was used to make the concrete blocks. Column Doyle, that I just spoke of. And now we're going to talk about Column Cork, Associate Director. Column is a chartered structural engineer with experience working in the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and Ireland. He worked at Mott MacDonald London in 2007 to 2013. I'm familiar with Mott MacDonald from Dr. Thomas St. John. He has been with DBFL since 2017, and he is also one of the added IS 465 registrants. As you can see, DBFL Consulting Engineers is well represented on the technical committees as members, as well as chairpersons for IS 398 Part 2, 2013, which is held up since 2013 with no amendments to the remedial methods. The 4 added IS 465 registrants, Martin Bennett, Michael Connolly, Colum Doyle, and Colum Cork, as well, both Martin Bennett and Michael Connolly are on the IS 398 register and IS 465 register, and both with DBFL since 2003. As well, both Martin Bennett and Michael Connolly are on the IS 398 register and IS 465 register, and both with DBFL since 2003. Engineer firm AOCA has 2 engineers that have both been on the technical committees 58 and 63, and one that was on the TC 58 with Aidan O'Connell, Brian Bryn. One of the engineers for AOCA, Colin Scott, I mentioned him before. He was a previous engineer employed by DBFL. Colin Scott is a senior engineer at Aidan O'Connell and Associate from 2010 to present. Former associate at DBFL, Dublin 2003 to 2009. AOC Ltd. was appointed to the NSAI IS 398 Technical Committee tasked with writing the new IS 398 standards on behalf of the Engineer Ireland. Colin attended the IS 398 Part 2 committee meetings. So we're going to talk now about Aidan O'Connell. He is the managing director of AOCA Limited, first became active in the pyrite field of engineering, CERSA 2005, through the investigation of insurance damage claims under standard home insurance policies. Recognizing that this was becoming a significant problem in the greater Dublin area, we researched all available literature and case histories to ascertain the potential impact in Ireland. So I'm reading this from his also professional summary. At the same time, AOC Limited was appointed to the lead engineering practice for Premier Guarantee in Ireland, dealing with all pyrite claims under the Structural Guarantee Scheme. As a result, we wrote the first testing and investigation protocols for Ireland, from which the IS 398 standard has been developed. AOCA Limited was appointed to the NSAI IS 398 standard committees with the task of writing the new IS 398 standard on behalf of Engineer Ireland, attending both the Part 1 and Part 2 meetings, along with 2 other colleagues from my practice. And I mentioned them. They were Colin Scott and Brian Bryn. And then AOC Limited has carried out 3 research projects to date with NUI Galway and has published on technical paper on pyrite, 1 technical paper on pyrite degradation. Currently, we have 2 more research projects with NUI Galway and Sheffield University. In 2012, set up the MPAS Limited a property audit company for the insurance industry. With the wide range of developments and country coverage that we are dealing with, it is reasonable to say that AOCA Limited is the leading consulting engineer practice dealing with the pyrite problem in Ireland. Aidan O'Connell has been on all 5 technical committees and both registrars IS 398 and IS 465. He assisted the expert group in 2022 and also attended the DAL meeting in June 23, 2022, along with Mr. Paul Ford. A month prior to attending the DAL, Mr. O'Connell also attended a Clare conference, Losing Our Homes, put on by Martina Clary of the Clare Coalition. I watched the conference, and at one point, Mr. O'Connell stated not much was known about Pyrite when IS 465 was drafting the grant scheme. However, 3 weeks later at the DAL meeting, he stated that he knew about Pyrite during the IS 398 theater, which was, the IS 398 was in 2013. So if he's saying at this May 30th conference in 2022 that not much was known in 2018 when they were writing the draft for IS 465, not much was known about Pyrite, and then 3 weeks later he states we knew about it during the IS 398. Well, that was going on from 2012 to 2013. And what happened in 2012? The Pyrite Symposium put on by Dr. Brian Hawkins, who came to Ireland to educate folks on pyrite and pyrite. I just in the first 5 pages, I think I counted him using that reference, that term, pyrite, pyrite, 41 times. So, and in the first 5 pages, he mentions that pyrite is located in 24 locations. So, yeah, they knew about pyrite and pyrite back in 2012, 2013. So to come out and say in 2018 not much was known about it, when, geez, in 2011 and 2012, Canada was dealing with it quite intently. The pyrite crisis in Quebec, the pyrite heave in Montreal, but the pyrite crisis in Canada was well on its way. They had a remediation scheme by 2018. They, in fact, came to Connecticut in October. The first time they came to Connecticut was October 2016 to discuss the coalition, the grassroots efforts, and then they came back again in October of 2019. So there was a lot known about it, and there was a lot known about our situation because public awareness was in 2015. And if you type in Debbie MacCoy /Pyrite, you'll see page after page after page me discussing Pyrite. So when they did their desktop study from 2016 to 2017, that would be the what they called the expert panel. It just stayed with mica. It never went any further with Pyrite. They said County Donegal, which is the hardest hit county, was hit by mica. But if you take that out of the equation and you say there's 20 counties now that are affected by pyrite heave or pyrite in the concrete blocks, and only 1 county that's affected by mica, no. We all know now through the scientific research by experts from Switzerland, Norway, Ireland, USA, Canada, that in fact the issue is pyrite. So however, 3 weeks later at the DAL meeting, he stated that we knew about pyrite during the IS 398 theater. He came off a bit indignant when asked about foundations, and Mr. Paul Ford stated in that DAL meeting in June 23rd, 2022, that he would hand off the grenade to Mr. O'Connell when asked about Pyrite and the foundations. Well, I'd like to discuss all the engineers involved in both the Pyrite Remediation Scheme and the Grant Scheme, and how the engineers for the first instance worked extremely well designing and writing the remediation scheme as mentioned. I'm perplexed by some of the engineers' attitude regarding the DCB Grant Scheme. The reluctance to acknowledging the damages caused by Pyrite, but I'm limited by time, so I will pick up discussing the engineers involved in the iron sulfide mineral crisis in Ireland since 2005. These engineers are Damon MacCoy, Karen Gallagher, Martin Doherty, Thomas Campbell, Rory O'Connor, Ambrose McCluskey, and many more. It's important to understand their experience, expertise, and involvement and attitudes, and as such, how their opinion matters in the treatment and delivery of these two schemes. While I have a little bit of time left, I will, just off the cuff, explain why it's important to understand the folks that are involved in both schemes. The first scheme, as I've mentioned now 3 or 4 or 5 times, because I did the 3-part series in 2025 regarding the two schemes and the disparity between the two schemes. And then last segment, episode, I discussed the folks involved in the housing agency, the Department of Housing, the Pyrite Resolution, and the expert group. These are engineers and experts in their field. Martin Lynch, he's an engineer. John O'Connor, he's an engineer. They were both, the housing agency was created in 2012. They both came from the housing agency, but they became involved in the Pyrite Resolution Board, informal, Mr. O'Connor in 2012, along with Paul Ford, Sean Ball, Carolyn Gill, and then the formal Pyrite Resolution Board that overseen the Pyrite Remediation Scheme worked very well with the housing agency. And to date, they have 3,000 homes repaired. Right now, in the DCB scheme, and folks, both things happened at the same time. They were both happening at the same time. But Dublin, which is where the capital is, when they became issues with so many, I mean, they said there was a propensity of 60,000 homes affected. When they got involved with that, they put their heads together. And like I told you before, experts flew in from, England and other countries to help the folks understand Pyrite. Dr. Michael Mayer, he was born in Dublin and educated in Dublin at Trinity College. And at 27 years old, he and his wife moved to Canada. And he worked at Goldair Association in Vancouver, Canada. And he came back to Ireland in 2005. His mother was ill, and he wanted to take care of her. And he was setting up a Goldair Association in Ireland. So we had folks like Dr. Michael Mayer and Dr. Brian Hawkins and James Lombard and Mike Eaton. And I'm going to speak about those in the part 3 of the stakeholders involved. Because as I mentioned before, there was the first wave of experts that came. And the engineers took, after they chased the cracks for a while, in 2006, they asked for help. And Dr. Michael Mayer reached out to one of his colleagues, Fred Schremer, who I've mentioned, and he's a photographer, geologist, and he, did a petrographic analysis of the stone infill and the aggregate infill. And it was at that time when they confirmed Pyrite heave. And that was in 2007, summer of 2007. By October 2007, they formed a committee. And by December 2007, Standard Recommendation 21, that's attached to the Harmonized European Norm 13242, 2002, that was amended, and so that folks knew about pyrite in the infill. They moved so quickly, and they used their expertise to understand the cause, the implication for a remediation scheme, and they called it a remediation scheme. And they understood the homeowners had nothing to do with the cause of their homes being destroyed. They understood it, and they dealt with it by not charging the victims, not charging them any money. There was no cost to the homeowners. Now you fast forward, and while that's still going on, the homes that were built in Donegal and Mayo and Clare and Limerick and Sligo and so on and so forth, they were being built with concrete blocks, and the concrete was made with aggregate that had reactive pyrite and reactive pyrite. Now, what does that say to the audience? Well, there's EU standards for quarries and for the aggregate. And so if there's two standards, the EN 13242 and the EN 12620, then and they're very specific about two iron sulfide minerals, pyrite and pyrrhotite, and they have limits. And the pyrite's limit is 1%, whereas the pyrrhotite limit is 0.1%. That's 1/10. And so it's very important to understand that they need to get it right, and they didn't. They got it right on the first instance, but they didn't get it right on the second instance. They came up with mica, and Karen Gallagher said he was one of the first to identify it in 2011 as being a mica issue. And, he sent the blocks off to look for any abnormalities. And I just don't understand. And also, Mike Eaton from Sandburg did a paper in May of 2019, and he talks about Donegal's mica issue and the way he came up with testing for mica content. And yet, he mentions in May of 2019 that he hadn't seen pyrrhotite. Now, what's confusing to me is that a lot of folks were upset when Ann and Eileen came to Connecticut in October of 2019 and didn't go back home and discuss the pyrrhotite that they learned that Canada and USA were dealing with. Well, they're not experts. They're not geologists. They went by the experts that told them their issue was mica. I went with it too. I listened to their presentation, and I thought, okay, it's mica. And I called it mica up until February 2022 was the last time I mentioned mica, because as of March 2022, when myself and a group of the expert geologists, photographers, engineers, we addressed Brussels. And you can actually see that here on this show, because CBC does show that. So the paper that Mike Eaton did in 2019, he mentioned pyrrhotite. And yet, as I mentioned, the ladies didn't come until October 2019. And also, Carolyn Lumsden came to Ireland in February 2019, and she spoke to individuals about what was happening in the USA with Pyrite. So Ireland heard about Pyrite firsthand, what was happening in the USA in February of 2019. Mike Eaton does this paper and mentions that in the testing, he's seen no Pyrite. And then October 2019, Ann and Eileen come to the USA. They hear about Canada's Pyrite issue. They hear about the USA's Pyrite issue, and they explain the mica issue. And as I mentioned, I thought it was mica all along, 2019, 20, 21. But in August of 2021, Eileen reached out to me in an email with Damon Owens, the Director General of Engineer Ireland, and I will talk about him in the next segment. And also in it was John O'Connor. And he's also an engineer. And as I told you, he has many hats. He's the chairman of the PRB. He was one of the chairs of the expert groups. He's been involved with Mr. Ford and Mr. Lynch for quite a while now. So also I wanted to mention that in November of 2024, they asked Mr. Ford to take a look at the research on the Pyrite and see if there was any implications on the enhanced scheme. And I'm hoping upon hope, because he's very bright. He's extremely bright, and he could be the key to making this scheme finally be where victims can get their homes whole again, mortgageable, saleable, insuranceable. So that's very important. I am running out of time, so I do want to mention to you all that I don't understand why the Pyrite is an issue, especially when Dr. Brian Hawkins mentions there's 3 forms of pyrite: the cubal form, the framboidal form, and the pyrite form. He mentions in one of his chapters in the book that keeps falling while we're doing this segment. It's fallen 3 times. So he's with me right now. But he mentions those 3 forms, and that pyrite can be converted into pyrite under the heat, the temperature. So I'll look into that chapter a little more so I can give you a little more insight into the conversion of pyrite to pyrite. But IS 465 should be about pyrite and pyrite, and the mica is only a contributing factor, people. All it does is allow the ingress of water and oxygen so that the pyrite can oxidize. If pyrite's encapsulated and water and oxygen never get to it, then it won't oxidize, causing second mineral formation and internal sulfide attack. So it's very important that Mr. Ford, who's had that information for a year now, the research, that he takes it in hand in the expert group, and that he advises the new minister, James Brown of Department of Housing, of what the implications of this research is. And that is that homes that have pyrite need to be removed and replaced. No options 1 through 5. The only option available to the victims should be option 1, which is remove and replace. And that means the entire home has to come down. Now, we haven't talked about the foundations. As part of a grant scheme, you have to keep something in place, and they're keeping the foundations in place. And I know People are concerned about it, and my feeling is this: if the foundations are an issue, then test them at the same time you test the blocks. Testing is no longer something that the homeowners have to pay. The housing agency now does it. So when the housing agency hires one of their consulting engineers that are working with them, which is DBFL, they can start testing the blocks and the foundation for pyrite and peritite. I'm on my last few seconds, so I just want to say thank you for staying in with me on the Ireland crisis. I've got 2 more shows on it, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you again in a month.